Hi, everybody. Before I get into my spiel, I just want to make sure our sound is working. So I'm going to wait for confirmation. Rose, is the sound working? Bear with us. Testing, testing. Just give us a sec, folks. We want to make sure that it's absolutely working. Testing, testing. Oh, seems like the sound is not working unless someone in the chat can confirm. Oh, the chat says that it's working. Okay, good. Then we are just going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us early on a Saturday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Emma. Happy October, and thanks for coming to our October series for this iteration of Death to Museums. This month, we're going to be posing the question, what comes after the death of museums? Instead of calling to reform white supremacist structures, can we create something entirely new? So we hope that this new format that we're experimenting with, which will be a panel conversation, will spur both dreaming and immediate action. Like I said, this format will be a panel. So our panelists will discuss some prompts for about an hour and a half. And the last 30 minutes, we'll be collecting questions from the audience chat. So you can put your question at any time during this series in the chat box, and we will be compiling all of those questions to be asked at the last 30 minutes of this event. A little bit about Death Museums. We're a grassroots, volunteer-run virtual dialogue series started by three recent graduates of a museum studies program, me, Emma Turner Trujillo, and off-screen, June An and Rose Cannon, where we had a lot of time on our hands and a lot of anger towards the way that museums were treating us and our colleagues. We're really in awe of what this project has become, and we hope to continue to provide honest, radical, and forward-thinking programs by BIPOC museum and cultural workers. If you want to tag anything related to these talks on any social media platform, you can use the tag hashtag Death to Museums. We also greatly appreciate donations. We are just about $100 short of our donation goal for this month, so that we can ensure that we pay all of our incredible speakers, which we've been really thankfully been able to do in our last two iterations. You can donate to us on PayPal at deathtomuseums@gmail.com, or you can become a patron on Patreon, where very soon we're going to be cooking up some merchandise, so keep your eyes peeled for that as well. So before we get started, we want to deliver a land acknowledgement because even though this conference is digital, physically we are located in Chicago, Illinois. So we want to read this acknowledgement, which is provided for us by Heather Miller, who's the executive director of the American Indian Center here in Chicago. Our colleague, Dr. Miranda Roberts, taught us about the process of drafting and delivering a land acknowledgement that incites action and recognizes the complexity of this practice, which too often just becomes another piece of protocol. We know that delivering these words is not enough. As a group that strives to be anti colonial and anti racist and imagine that future for museums, we're dedicated to centering Indigenous ways of knowing in each aspect of our work. In recent years, it's become a trend to acknowledge the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples of a particular area through a land acknowledgement. This type of activity is designed to bring more awareness and understanding of the history of Indigenous peoples and their territories and ongoing histories. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to starting this process of learning and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and genocide. As the following land acknowledgement is read, I charge you to dig deeper and challenge your thinking. Find information about the tribes that call your area home. Read a book by a Native author, watch a Native film or a documentary, or make a donation to a Native serving organization in your area. We will have this information on our Twitter, but we always suggest, if you can, please donate any amount to the American Indian Center of Chicago. Chicago is the traditional homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, like the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. Located at the intersection of several great waterways, the land naturally became a site of travel and healing for many tribes. American Indians continue to call this area home. And now Chicago is home to the sixth largest urban American Indian community that still practices their heritage and traditions and care for the lands and waterways. Today, Chicago continues to be a place that calls many people from diverse backgrounds to live and gather here. Despite the many changes that the city has experienced, we as the inhabitants of this city see the importance of the land and this place that has always been a city home to many diverse backgrounds and perspectives. So we're going to take some time, maybe about a couple minutes, if you'd like to do some research about local Native organizations, or if you'd like to go to our Twitter and find information about how you can donate to the American Indian Center of Chicago. And while we're waiting on that, we're going to get our panelists on screen. In alphabetical order by last name, just to be kind. So first, I will let Yaa introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Yaa Yaa. I'm currently calling in from Accra, Ghana. I'm in my study, and yes, so a bit about me. I am a writer, curator, and community educator. I studied African art history and exhibition architecture, and then began working with Anno Institute of Arts and Knowledge in 2018 on a mobile museum, which was experimenting with museums in a kiosk structure, which is a common nomadic commercial structure, very common in West Africa. And so it traveled around the different regions of Ghana and had a accompanying cultural encyclopedia of African art. As of 2020, I began working at a commercial gallery and thinking more about the way that African art is commodified, extracted, and the cultural narratives around it are controlled around the world. And so, as of about 4 months ago, I founded an art futurist studio called Across Studio, which currently has two offerings: Decolonize the Art World, which is an online anti-colonial art history platform, and the Imaginarium, which is a virtual residency program for Ghanaian digital artists who are world building. So my curatorial interests at the moment are currently focused on Indigenous African invention and cultural technology. So that's a bit about me, and I'm very honored today to be here with the amazing panelists and with Death to Museums.
Thank you so much, Yaa. Okay, next, if I can do my alphabetizing correctly, I believe is, can I do the alphabet? Maybe, let's see. What the heck, let's just do Matt. Matt Manalo.
Hello, my name is Matt Manalo. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a male, person of color in my mid-30s, with black hair and yellow round glasses. I'm standing in front of a white wall with bookshelves and paintings leaning at the home studio in Houston, Texas. I'm an artist and a community organizer. I was born and raised in Manila, Philippines, and has called Houston, Texas home since 2004. I received in painting at the University of Houston, and I run a community-based alternative art space called the A-Leaf Art House, and I founded a multidisciplinary art community named Philippine X Artists of Houston. I create work which involves elements of painting, drawing, sculpture, photography, and printmaking. Being a first generation immigrant, my work discusses my experiences navigating around the physical and social structures of society while exploring social issues like erasure, colorism, and colonial mentality.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for forgiving my lack of alphabetical knowledge. That was great. Next up, I think, is Felicia Garcia.
All right. Haku everyone, Maktuk Felicia Garcia, Alap Shamala Shumash, Ni Kashcho Iti. Hello everyone, my name is Felicia Garcia. I'm Samala Shumash and I am very happy to be here with you today. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently sitting in my guest room slash home office in Ogopoge, which is Tewa territory or Santa Fe, New Mexico. I am a light-skinned woman of color in my late 20s with brown hair, red glasses. Yeah, and so I am the curator of education at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I work at an institution or a division of the institution called the Indian Arts Research Center. But in my spare time, I do a lot of work on land acknowledgements, advocating for cultural institutions such as museums, universities, like libraries, archives, etc., to adopt the practice. I started this work when I was in graduate school in New York City and was really shocked to see a lack of information or representation about the indigenous people of that region. And so I created a guide that hopefully would be accessible and, you know, explain the need for this practice. And so in 2018, I created the Guide to Indigenous Land and Territorial Acknowledgements for Cultural Institutions. I worked with my mentor, Dr. Jane Anderson, to create this guide. And it is just a single sheet of paper, front and back, and meant to be sort of an FAQ or intro to land acknowledgements. And it answers the questions of, well, it provides some answers. I definitely don't claim to have the right answers or all the answers. You know, these are just my perspectives on the topic. And so it addresses the questions of what is a land acknowledgement? Why are they important? Why should cultural institutions adopt this practice? Suggestions for creating your own, and then a resource section because I really like to make it clear that land acknowledgement is an Indigenous protocol first and foremost. And though I spend a lot of time doing this work, countless Indigenous scholars, activists, community members have been doing this work long before me. And so I like to direct people to those individuals and resources. Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Felicia, thank you so much. Okay, next up, I think, is Jordan.
De onde babon, de onde bats dom toyak oi ma ka, toy boga paltika bego nedo. Hello everyone, my name is Jordan Poorman Cocker. I'm the daughter of Deborah, daughter of Gail, who is the daughter of Alice, and the daughter of Keen Tuttle, Dragonfly Woman. I'm a Koigu, Native American from the Kiowa tribe. On my dad's side, I'm a descendant of Vili Fakatahatupofa, and my dad is Gelikikoka, and our family are from Vava'u and Tongatapu, the whaling islands of Tonga, via Aotearoa, so New Zealand, for the past 4 generations. I'm calling in today from Pawhuska, Oklahoma, which is traditional treaty territory for Washaje, the Osage Nation. And I work currently with the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So that's about an hour drive south from me, which is there I'm working as a curatorial scholar of Native American art. And really a kind of first of its kind effort to delve into the Indigenous paintings collection on 2D substrate from an Indigenous perspective. So my work is really centered around um, recognizing genealogies and recognizing indigenous technologies as ways to teach the world new things about our community. Um, and, really that also includes addressing a lot of colonial structures and historical and present day racism and how to navigate that for the betterment of indigenous communities. And uh, there's so much that's sort of lost in the translation between indigenous art and design and the exhibitions that we see today in many museums. And my indigenous future includes having those stories told from our own voices and our own perspectives. So super happy to be here today with all of you. Oh.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Okay, next up is Lyra.
Hi, my name is Lora Montero, and I am. I've done many things, I think, but oh right, I'll first explain or describe who I am. So I'm a brown-skinned person with black hair, short black hair, in my late 30s, wearing an orange shirt and a in front of a white wall with a black IKEA unit in front of it. And I'm here in my apartment in New York City. And I use she and Z pronouns. And thinking about the topic of this particular gathering, I'm realizing how much it is the case that like the work I do, which is in all kinds of different places, including formal academic settings and formal museum settings, and entirely not either of those, is really driven by an awareness that I am the product of the best, colonial white supremacist education has to offer, and that has, put me in a position where, I have access to certain kinds of spaces that other people who look like me don't have necessarily. But I know, and the better, more I get to know those spaces, the more I realize I don't think that they have what we need, right? Um, and uh, and not only that, it troubles me immensely how much how hard it is to see the ways in which white supremacy and colonialism are built into all of these structures. Um, Now, working within those institutions, there's only so far I've found that I can go, at least with my level of patience. And so I often work outside of them. And in many ways, I prefer that. I love working in spaces where people are for a reason that has nothing to do with, going to a museum and learning something, or like experiencing great art or anything like that, because that is, for one, a limited audience, but also an audience that like has an agenda around how they interact with what they're going to see in that museum. And then they leave it to a large degree in that building, wherever that building is, and then go about their day, right? I like to create projects through this group called the Museum on Site, which is 12 years ago tomorrow was actually when we had our first project. Um, and that are in places where people already are for other kinds of reasons. And not only is that like probably a more diverse audience than will end up in most museum spaces, but again, it's an audience that is there for another reason, and therefore is, I find, more emotionally available to engage with the work that they are presented with or that they are offered, if they choose to, right? And also, this work I found has the potential to, forever change how people understand environments that they commute through, that they live in, right? That they, the parks in their neighborhoods, these kinds of things. So that is that's really where I come at this from, is very much from the alternative structures, right? Like because as far as I'm concerned, to the same degree that the museum is a colonial institution and its buildings are colonial objects and all of these things, so is our entire landscape, right? This is all about like architectures of power, all about understanding how, in the same way that it's hard for most people to see, or for a lot of people to see how whiteness is embedded in the structures of our society, it's also embedded in the buildings, in the streets, in the layout of our cities, and all of these things. And that's really, I think, where most of my excitement and energy comes from these days.
Lyra, thank you so much. Last and certainly not least is Camille Mary.
Hi, everyone. My name is Camille Mary Sharp. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman in my late 20s with long brown hair, wearing a black shirt, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in Canada. I'm so happy and grateful to be here with you all. I'm calling from my bedroom in the northwest end of Toronto, also known as Takaranto, or the place in the water where there are trees standing in the Mohawk language. I'm a French-born settler on these Indigenous lands that have long been shared by the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. These lands are sacred lands, subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which seeks to ensure the peaceful sharing and caring of the region around the Great Lakes. I'm here today thanks to the incredible support of my colleagues, my PhD supervisor, and the museum studies community at the University of Toronto. So thank you. I'm also here today because of my interest in museum structures, particularly funding structures, and what it means for funding and governance during this decades-long movement that is decolonization and anti-oppression in museums. So I'm currently writing my dissertation on Canadian museums that receive funding from the oil industry. And although I'm sure our discussion today will extend beyond issues of funding by fossil fuel industries, I'm really interested in the implications of oil sponsorship, for example, on museum practice in Canada, but also the implications of this exciting moment that we're in, a moment of institutional divestment from destructive industries, of radical activism in museums, and of decolonization on existing funding structures in museums. So I'm really excited to hear from everyone today about what kind of alternatives we might be dealing with.
Thank you so much, Camille Marie. And of course, I've neglected to do as I say, not as I do, but here's my visual introduction. And thank you for everyone who presented themselves that way. My name is Emma Turner Trujillo. I am a light-skinned Mexican woman. I have light skin, short brown hair, and I'm wearing a sparkly blue sweater. And behind me is some foliage that I hope can see you, because plants are the only thing bringing me joy right now. So let's get right into these first questions. First, I think this question can probably apply to a lot of the work that you all do. And here at Deaf to Museums LLC, we don't believe in reform. We believe in destruction and reimagining. But how do you carve out space in these institutions if you're asked to maybe be brought on as a guest curator, or maybe you already work in this institution? How do you personally carve out space for a radical reimagining in a historically colonial institution? And to follow that question, when is it just time to leave and start your own? I feel like Matt should answer this question.
Hey, well, I think the time is now, because the need is now as well. I believe that carving out space also begins with, what the idea of space is. It could be a physical space, or it could be something that we share between, other folks, by giving them space, like space to speak, and I think that's where we could actually like start that, and make it community centered, um, because um, when we think about colonial institutions, one thing that they've erased or decided to take away is like the history or the heritage, and the culture of these communities. So one way to kind of defeat that, or to carve out the space again and reimagining um, new spaces, is by bringing the idea of community back. Um, and yeah, I guess we could start there.
That was a great lead off. Thank you. I put you on the spot. That was great. I think maybe the next person who could maybe talk about starting their own space is Yaa.
Yes, I 100% agree with Matt in what they said about community and centering community. A lot of my my work at this point has been in sort of in trying to reimagine museum structures, and particularly this summer, I have been really inspired by the work that abolitionists have been doing to get people to think about prisons not just as a place, but as carceral logic and as a set of practice and rituals. And that really just broke open a whole portal in my mind in how I approach museum studies as well, because then I realized with previous experiments, the Kiosk Museum, my thesis tries to conceptualize a museum using indigenous African cultural thought. The things I would come up against is it would still be a museum at the end of the day. And part of that was because I was not able to identify museum logic specifically and then sort of work outside of that. So I feel like that's sort of the work that I have been doing now, and very recently with Decolonize the Art World had something I'm describing as a dream tank with participants where we had a guerrilla theory session, which is a term coined by Nema Githere, a Kenyan American theorist, and a speculative design session about our futures. And most participants' futures involved what I thought was very interesting, involved intimacy, clearly like a need for greater intimacy, and also a need to, or thinking about nature, we're thinking about the interconnectedness of culture production and nature. And that really warmed my heart because it's so it's I don't even know if these are new like reimaginations. If anything, I see it as a return, especially when studying um, because museums were like our colonial structures inherited in the African context, but in a number of other contexts as well. If I describe it as a return, because going back to performance, embodiment, embracing ephemera, not necessarily claiming what's the word, permanence as like a monument to cultural narrative, and the world building truths of a museum is very much in line with indigenous African cultural thought. So yes, anyway, that's sort of what that's those are my thoughts around that.
I want you to keep speaking on this forever. That was transcendent. Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to follow up with that? Jordan, I do see you're unmiked. Did you want to say something?
Cool. I was typing. That was an accident. But yes, I'm happy to talk on this topic. Really carving out space, I feel like, is such a personal thing for Indigenous communities, especially in the US, where we think about our own spatial connections to land and time and genealogy and ancestral territory. And there's been, of course, so many deep histories that were really sort of at least well referenced in the land acknowledgements that were shared today. But for myself, I feel like holding space is also holding intellectual space and ancestral space, and really acknowledging that colonial or hyper academic ways of thinking and knowing and doing are not the only sources of value, or only locales to kind of orient ourselves when we think about objects or we think about art. And so that work is, for me, quite personal work. I feel like there's a duality between community knowledge and then whatever else happens in the city or whatever else happens in the institution. And being able to kind of speak across those processes is certainly a way to connect community and ancestral wisdom to these museum spaces or gallery spaces where our art and our ancestors' art is represented.
Yeah, I think some of the themes that I keep hearing you all touch upon is the edifice itself, of course, being a tool of ongoing settler colonialism, and what Ya touched upon in terms of community, as well as Matt. So this leads to my follow-up question. So when is enough enough? When do you leave the edifice to crumble on its own? And maybe what are some tips to start your own creative spaces for some of you who've been involved in that? I see Lyra. Yes.
I think in some ways, right, and very much agreeing with Matt, like the time is now. That's the time. Um, uh, but also the time is now for a reason that I guess I kind of thought was implicit in the conceptualization of death to museums, but also, but beyond that, I don't really see enough people talking about, which is our institutions aren't able to function right now. All of our cultural institutions, not just museums, they're all terrible. There's no reason not to just tear it all down right now. Why go back to them? Why donate your money to them, right? Like, this is the coronavirus has given us an incredible opportunity. you know there are not very many good things that have come out of this, but I do really feel that way. That, like, if anything, I mean, this is part of, in the theater world, the Dear White American Theater letter, which some of you may be familiar with. I think that was only really possible in many ways, for Black and Brown theater artists to all come together and sign this massive letter together that really calls out white American theater, which is, that's who runs theater in this country. Um, I don't think they could have done that if their shows were up, right? And they had to go to work every day and actually see face to face the people who they are calling out. No, I don't think so. Or if their plays hadn't already been canceled going forward. And so I think, like, I do want to. I hope we will see more of that momentum now. As to the other part of that, I also think that both in relation to, like, the when is the time and the tips angle of it, I know that for me, in developing my work with the museum on site, it has, which for many years was alongside work with more traditional museums and in more traditional museum settings, um, was about, keeping an eye out for opportunity, for collaborators, for moments, for spaces, for invitations. Basically, it's kind of how I think about them, right? And not trying to force it, and recognizing that if your model isn't making sense, then it's not the right model, and that's okay. And the right model is going to come for you, right? um, uh, because, yeah, I mean, in terms of venturing outside of the museum for the first time to create work in public space, back in 2008, um, honestly, that that particular instance was very directly informed by having just been at the first international conference for the inclusive museum, where I heard, again and again throughout this incredible week, I kept on hearing from, the people who were running the formerly colonial museums in their countries. And these are brilliant people with just beautiful ideas and so much energy, and which it looked to me like they were throwing into this hole that was created by the colonizers, in terms of, the space that they have to worry about humidity in to protect the objects that they didn't necessarily want to collect anyway, and that were collected in a racist way in order to show how terrible, stupid they are, right? And not to mention donors, right? Not to mention all of the things, right? And all the expectations around museums. And I just kind of was like, why? Why do that? And I know that I do absolutely believe that there are some real values in working within museum spaces. But I do know that for myself, looking for that invitation, you know 12 years ago, and taking it the time since then that it has come up, has been way more satisfying than any work I've done in a museum.
You spoke to my heart and my soul. And I think we've hit the root of the problem, is that if museums really wanted to change everything about themselves, we couldn't call them a museum anymore. And they're so frightened of loosening that power because it's all they know. And Lyra, what you talked about in your introduction, this is what we're taught in higher arts education. You're taught this is the way you categorize and organize a collection. This is the way you disseminate information. This is the way you check the humidity level on a vitrine. And there's just no imaginative thinking in that way. So thank you for touching upon that very good statement. So one of the other questions we had, unless I see Camille and then Felicia.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your really grounded perspectives on this question. I'm not coming to you right now from a museum. I'm coming to you from an academic space. So I wanted to maybe just circle back to the opening question about radical reimaginings. I just wanted to maybe, first of all, what we're doing now, I think, is wonderful. Creating community, engaging in radical discussions. Secondly, listening to and supporting the people and communities that are leading these discussions, racialized and or queer museum professionals, the indigenous communities from which many of our museums hold artifacts, and especially I have to say the student groups that are really kind of pushing the envelope of what can be imagined. This is such a significant bubbling moment in museums for many reasons, but truly I want to tip my hat to the students who are either currently pursuing a degree in museum studies or have recently graduated, or early career professionals who are, you know, really disenchanted and frustrated with the state of the field, and who have seized this opportunity like Death to Museums to push for better and kind of shake museums to their core. And lastly, I think looking to the future like we are today, but also looking to the past for guidance. So much radical work has been done before us that isn't always highlighted either in museums or in literature. And finding out these histories, I think, can really help shape our current lens and obtain clarity. So, for example, why is it that museums were experiencing protests against kind of icky sponsors as early as the 1970s, at least here in Canada, um, and that even one of those protests that I'm researching in the late 80s is still regarded to this day as a symbol of momentous shift in Canadian museum practice, and yet funding structures, you know, decades later, remain relatively the same. Or what can we learn from the institutional critique movement of the previous generation of artists, museum professionals, and activists? What can we learn from those things to keep moving forward?
Thank you, Camille. That was excellent to remember that the past doesn't always mean bad. The colonial past is terrible, but that's not all that exists in the past. And Felicia, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, thank you all for your comments. I think it's really inspiring to see all of you who have left museums. I think that's really brave and you're doing incredible work. But I think Jordan started to touch on this in her statement. It's so complicated being an Indigenous person who works in museums because, you know, they hold so much of our cultural patrimony, our relatives, our ancestors. And as much as I like really hate these institutions a lot of the time, you know, I feel invested in them to an extent because I have like the honor and the responsibility in my role to be there as, you know, like an advocate for them and for the community so that they can have access to those relatives. And so I think Emma and everyone else who said this, you're absolutely right. If a museum actually were community centered, it wouldn't be a museum at all. And so that's kind of what I try to do with land acknowledgements is I don't think a land acknowledgement decolonizes a museum. You know, they're not radical. But I think they can be a vessel for starting conversations about narrative and power and reimagining these spaces so that, I mean, eventually they are community centered and there is better access to those ancestors, those relatives, or pathways for them to leave these institutions. I don't think we can create those pathways without having these conversations first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I wanted to say like going off of that, I've been thinking a lot about like the root of museums, and very recently was reading about the word museum coming from museon, meaning temple to the muses. And so I've been playing with that and like, okay, so if this is really a portal, if museums in the initial sort of conceptualization were portals or were altars to inspiration, then a museum can be reinvented and has been reinvented many times over the course of its conceptualization. Um, and so I do also, because when even with hearing the death to museums or hearing abolished museums, I think for some people it inspires like fear, and I've been thinking about why that is, because in my heart I'm like, well, that doesn't mean that then there is no space for cultural engagement. It's just that museums can look incredibly different. Like the word itself is not tied to the manifestation of them today. And on that, when Jordan was introducing herself, they mentioned technology, and I have been looking to, the tech industry is also messy in all of its ways, but I have been borrowing the language and practice of the tech industry and working a lot with creative technologists this year in particular, because I am inspired by the dedication to experimentation and failure. I really like the concept of research and development and prototyping, which I feel like in this particular moment of reimagining museums is very helpful. And it's sort of how I've been trying to position my work is these are just prototypes. This is a lot of research and development. The Serpentine Gallery in the UK just started a research and development lab a couple of months ago. The new museum in New York is also similarly moving in that direction of research and development. So that looks like a growing thing with museums. But then again, when this work happens in institutions, they're very good at co-opting it. And if you are controlling your own reimagination, well, then it can only go so far. But so I am also excited to see more individuals and more like studios like the Monument Lab in the US, which I also sort of see as a research and development studio of some kind. And also on, oh yes, on the difference between sort of reform and completely doing away with, one of the questions in the Dream Tank that Decolonize the Award recently led was, what would your great, great, great grandparents' relationship to a museum be? And that answer was very different for people depending on your, your background and all of these things. And I wouldn't even have to go as far back as great, great, great grandparents. It would just be great, great grandparents and be like, well, they would be in the museum, not as an audience, but on display, and still are. And in that case, I don't feel, out of respect for them, I'm not interested in redeeming them. This is not even an old practice. In Britain, this was happening in the 1940s and 50s. So it's not even that old for me to necessarily want to redeem. If anything, I'm really interested in how to get these museums to what's the word? Not only repatriate and looted ancestral art, but also the capital that they have accrued over these years, the millions of dollars and pounds that they have accrued, using those to fund community cultural institutions back in the communities that they have devastated culturally and also physically. So that's sort of where I am with that, and I still really respect and understand both working within and outside of the museum, because like water wears away a stone with sustained pressure. So I feel like it's really sort of coming at it at all directions. But my personal spirit really it's just so sort of I can't really take sort of being in museums for too long. But yes.
Thank you for speaking on something that I think we've also encountered with our name and organization, Deaf to Museums, even before we started it. People get very defensive. They're very protective of the idea of museums because their great-great-grandfather does not have the same experience as a BIPOC ancestral person would. And I don't know if Lyra is raising their hand, but yes, yeah, go for it.
Sure. I'm loving this conversation so much, by the way. I haven't done like a panel on the internets yet, and like this is fantastic. But yeah, I just wanted to jump in and with something that came up for me in thinking about what Yaa had said previously about the how useful you found abolitionist frameworks for thinking about how to thinking about the problem of the museum, right? And in terms of like carceral logics, museum logics, et cetera. And something that Camille Mary said about, what can we learn from the history of institutional critique? And I kind of feel like what we can learn from it, and excuse me for sounding maybe really jaded, is that it doesn't work, you know? Um, that even something as iconic as Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum It's there and then it's gone, right? Have you tried to find pictures of it on the internet? It's really hard, you know? As I know, every time I've lazily tried to throw together a presentation, you know, and and what impact did it actually have on the Maryland Historical Society? You know, or on most conversations other than like the people who are like, oh, did you see that? Oh yeah, it was so edgy, you know? Like museums are really good. Like just like, you know, the abolitionist movement is facing, right? Oh yeah, we'll just reform the police. Oh yeah, we'll just like, you know, close this major jail, but build a whole bunch of little ones all around town. You know, like it these systems are really good at self-preservation. And I think that institutional critique, if anything, is and was an important stage, right? I think that there are a couple of important stages in the destruction of museums, and that institutional critique is definitely one of them because it can open our eyes to our eyes and the eyes of other people who aren't thinking about these things at all, right? In a very concrete way um, to this stuff, but to what's wrong. But I don't think it's yeah. I think one of the things we learn is that it doesn't actually change much.
I think that's a very important distinction that if we don't abolish capitalism, nothing really changes. So that should be the goal. We should talk about this at length forever, but I have a few other questions that I'd love to get your responses on. This one might be specifically tailored for Camille Mary, but I'm sure other people can hop on. Museums and nonprofits heavily rely on wealthy donors and corporations to operate, and this inherently colors the political leanings of the museum's narrative, ensuring that they can't use their museum platform to go against these donors' beliefs. But what kind of funding models are possible apart from the donor system like we have in the United States and Canada?
Okay, I guess I'll try to tackle this. Again, forgive me for my kind of academic takes today. First, I want to say that I believe that we need a lot more research on the donor system, the sponsorship system, the overall funding dynamics of museums, because there isn't much out there. And most importantly, funding dynamics manifest in different ways in every museum, and are especially different between small and large museums. And we all know that there's something really icky about seeing like a weapons manufacturer's name on a gallery wall, especially when it's near an exhibition about resistance or about peace, about anti-racism, or even as museums are desperately trying to engage communities that are marginalized and underrepresented in museums and who often have very difficult histories and relationships with, in this case, war and militarism. But we don't actually have a lot of research or data about how these kinds of, again, icky financial partnerships affect our work, affect the work of other museum practitioners, and also how they affect our visitors. With that in mind, aside from not changing anything and continuing with business as usual, which is what a lot of museums appear to be doing with regards to their funding structures, I think there are at least like three set of options that are important to explore. And just keep in mind these are really like kind of speculative and half baked. But the first I want to highlight is divestment, which is currently happening. Lots of museums and universities are being pushed to kind of divest from certain industries. And what I want to say about that is what's next? What comes after that? Because a lot of, at least, fossil fuel industries are eventually going to be morphing into or being replaced by green capitalist companies that rely just as much on resource extraction and displacement of peoples as current fossil fuel companies. And this touches on what was asked, under capitalism, what can we really do? So as much as I'm a huge supporter of divestment campaigns for universities and museums, I don't think it's a sufficient long-term solution. And I always ask myself, is there such a thing as ethical philanthropy or ethical sponsorship under capitalism? The second thing is just working with what we got. So I know this is not a popular option for deaf to museum folks, but developing policy and understanding, of how these financial partnerships and dynamics really manifest, and developing guidelines. I've done research in museums where there's not even any sort of funding ethics policy in those museums. So at least working with what we got until maybe we reach the, I don't know, socialist utopia that many of us are hoping for. And then, but even then, there might be some issues, you know, like what kind of issues might we get with if we have just kind of single source funding from the government. And then lastly, something that maybe some of us might be really interested in today is just turning funding models completely on their head. And that's what I'm really interested in maybe exploring with my colleagues today. What might that look like? You know, what might something like community patronage look like? Why in museums and in museum studies, we're always talking about kind of shared ownership when it comes to exhibition making and programming and collections. Why aren't we talking about that when it comes to funding models? I'm really interested in these kinds of conversations.
I could talk about this for a million years, but I'm not on the panel. So is there anyone else who would like to follow up with that radical reimagining of how we fund museums? No one? Yes, Matt, and then Lyra.
You know, it's very interesting that Camille Mary is talking about, you know, museums being funded by fossil fuels, because that's a huge thing as well here in Houston. We are an oil city and we are heavily dependent on oil and gas and fossil fuel and all that. I myself, you know, it is a big question of how I can continue, um, you know, funding the space that I run, and how, you know, because even if with grants, uh, the grant system that happens here in Houston is still heavily relying on fossil fuels, because we get hotel taxes um, funneled to become, you know, like the arts funding, and those hotel taxes heavily rely on all these oil businessmen traveling to Houston. So, you know, but one way I've also found is that um, because my space is a shipping container, and I rarely really have any kinds of bills to pay for it to run it. Um, you know, I'm relying also on community support. You know, I believe in having a circular economy where we showcase artists and make sure that folks are getting paid, like with the community events that we have, and in return then they support the space to make it more sustainable. You know, just something really simple, like kind of like a 1 2 3, you know, nothing really complicated, you know. So yeah, I mean, it works for me that way, at least in my space with the A-Leaf Art House. um, um, and of course, you know, like with collaborations as well. I also mentioned community a lot because, you know, community folks are very rich in resources, you know, rich with stories and wisdom, and and that's something that systems or structures like museums can't really provide, other than what Lyra has already been saying. So yeah.
Lyra, I see we have a furry guest, and you're up next.
Yes, a co-panelist that y'all didn't invite. Sorry
Love it.
about that.
Love it.
I'm sure she'll be back. um, but yeah, thanks, Matt. It was really good to hear from you about like the funding questions on your end, because, you know, of course, I'm also like operating outside of a museum space, operating outside of really any like actual institutional structure. Like there was a conscious choice made not to go the nonprofit route, right? And well, one of the benefits of that is that, you know, when we're not actively doing anything, then our costs are like basically web hosting, you know, because we don't have a space, we don't have employees, we don't have all those things, right? But obviously, that's a much more precarious way to work than folks who are used to working in museums are used to, um, and uh, and provides a lot less security in terms of, you know, our ability to necessarily do the work we want to do on the one hand, but on the other hand, like I said, I think that in terms of invitations and stuff that have come together, when it's the right time, it's the right time, and the support comes. And that support sometimes comes in the form of, volunteers who are working on, who are dedicating their own skills to a project that is of meaning to them and for their community. Um, the museum on site has definitely been funded by a number of grants, which, as always with grants, right, all the things come up if it's not directly from kind of I love Camille Mary's way of putting it, from an icky sponsor, right? If it's not directly from that, it's probably, indirectly, right? In the way that Matt is describing. And frankly, which gets to what I've kind of felt from the beginning in doing this work is like, all money is blood money once you get back far enough. So then the question of like, is the problem putting the name on the gallery wall? Is that what makes it a problem? Or is it a problem just that you take it at all, right? And in which case, how far back do you have to go? How many times you have to wash that money in order for it to be okay to use it for art? Because let's be real, like even money that, if I donate money to somebody's project, it's coming from an icky place too, you know? Speaking of icky places that things come from, also one of the main funding models that the museum on site has had is stealing from institutions where folks are employed full time. And I mean, mainly and mostly that looks like stealing time. I have been in academia the entire time that the museum on site has been in existence, initially as a grad student at Brown, and now I'm a professor at Rutgers, and a whole lot of my time goes into this, and it is great because I get a paycheck because I'm full-time faculty, so that that's real, and in the spirit of Fred Moten's idea that we should be definitely stealing from the university if we're in the university. Oh hell yeah, right? I mean, that also looks like other resources within universities too, as well, right? If people are employed at universities, at museums, etc., any place that somebody is employed full time, but has some flexibility in terms of where they put their energy, where they put their work, right? I mean, for the most part, like Rutgers is thrilled that I do this work or that I use my time to do this work, but it's still, it's my project, right? And I am, yeah, and definitely it's more considered more valid now than when I had like a dissertation fellowship and was working on these projects. But yeah, so that's another model. I mean, I feel like under capitalism, we need to, people need to be able to pay their rent, and also we need to, there are materials costs and all these kinds of things. Um, but I guess in many ways, yeah, the idea of like keeping things as small as possible, the in between, like not having a bunch of full-time employees, not having a nonprofit structure with a board, not having an actual physical space that is, we need to pay for every month forever, right? Those are definitely things that have enabled that work to continue and be feasible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always, as much as we hope for the socialist utopia that will happen one day, we do need to be realistic about also not asking front of house museum workers, by people of color museum workers, to do this work themselves alone, because it's so much more of a risk for them to lose their positions and to lose their jobs. So white passing BIPOC folk like me and other white employees really need to be some of the ones to take the brunt to protect one another in these structures that we're currently fighting against. So I think that's a really good thing that you've touched upon, Lyra. So I think we can move into another question. And this one is pointed specifically at Felicia and Jordan, because we talked about this in our pre-panel talk. But once we destroy museums, we're going to be left with these edifices themselves. And these are products of buildings by white capitalists. As ongoing tools of colonial white supremacy, can these museum buildings, the physical buildings, be reinterpreted in ways that are less harmful to the objects and to the people who visit them?
I feel like there's a sort of juxtaposition between the way that we're talking about museums as only existing in these urban sort of centers. There certainly exists across the nation, across the continent, actually, in Canada as well, Indigenous museums and Indigenous heritage centers where the funding is far more diverse. The collection care practices are, depending on the the institution, in some cases Indigenous led. So we're looking at best practice for collection care and what that looks like from that sort of sector perspective. But we're also looking at spiritual care. We're also looking at ancestral protocols around handling certain objects. And there's people doing that work already. And that work has been going on since the 1950s. A good example of that is Sealaska Heritage Institute, where I went to an exhibit there a couple of years ago when I was on a work trip, and they were exhibiting some masks that had spiritual significance and sacredness attached to them. And around the masks, this was a gallery space, there was admissions. Around the masks were these plants that are used to keep those objects safe and protected spiritually, as well as people who encounter them. And so what it looks like for me to think about that question of disrupting norms, I think that's already happening in a lot of places. And these are where the intersections need to occur between mainstream museum professionals and practitioners and Indigenous museum practitioners and communities, and really allow communities to lead those conversations. Because if you want to talk about sustainability, if you want to talk about equity, all of our protocols around taking care of these taonga or sacred objects, they've been built in for centuries and they've been ignored by these different institutions. And I think, it's almost in terms of speaking in terms of healing, how do you heal something? You do the opposite of what, has happened in the past, and you do it repetitively over time in a way that allows people to really access dignity that was taken, really access connections and relational collective relations, have that access, give that access where that access was gone or taken or stripped away. And so I feel like I'm gonna just put a pin in it there, but these are the sorts of thoughts that I've been having as we've been kind of talking about funding. There's certainly museums. Suquamish Museum is right outside of Seattle. That's funded by Suquamish tribe, and the practices that are going on there is not what you're going to find as a public institution in Seattle. But I think those conversations are more and more happening across the industry, where people are understanding with these sort of decolonial projects, here's the harm that's being done. Where do we start? Where do we begin to have these conversations about shifting those norms?
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Does either maybe Felicia or Yaa want to jump in and maybe talk about that difference in understanding? I see Felicia. Yeah.
I mean, okay, that was really, really wonderful. And I could just like go on about tribal museums. And like at my institution, we work really closely with communities to determine the stewardship of the material in the collection. It's pretty much like whatever the community says is what we do. But I just really wanted to talk about the building, the idea of the physical building really quickly. I feel like we a lot of times forget that the building and the land are also part of the museum collection, and museums really prioritize ownership and that colonial notion of yeah, just like I think people forget that time and space and like organization of land are all colonial concepts. Like indigenous people, they're not just like objective truths, and then the land and the building are part of the collection and that ownership. And truthfully, like these buildings are colonial monuments. Like, is there a way to look at a monument and reinterpret it or repurpose it for something that's good? I don't think so. Like, I think that these buildings are monuments to colonialism and Western thought and ownership. And I mean, once we're done with museums, all of the ancestors' collections are returned, which, I have a lot of hope for. I just don't really see the possibility for like the land and the communities to heal when museums have worked so hard to use their spaces to reinterpret and overwrite indigenous identity and connections to place. I just don't think that we can like start to rebuild those connections or share those stories when those buildings are there.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, I thank you so much for sharing that. I especially have been thinking about that in relation to what's the word? Like how when looted ancestral art is repatriated, how it will be reintegrated into our cultural practices, especially because currently in Ghanaian sort of museum or exhibition culture, it's still very much using these colonial technologies of like display and museum practices. We no longer have well, the National Museum is sort of like defunct, but when it wasn't in existence, almost 50% of the collection came from a British anthropologist's personal collection, which is also just not a great way to start. And from that was still, was still on display as objects, was still like were very distanced, which is antithetical to the inherent purpose, which was very much both aesthetic and functional. And obviously, they can't be used in the same way because our needs have changed. But just to have them on display as opposed to engaged, I'm still thinking through that. And so when you talked about having those masks, but also having the plants that spiritually protected both the mask and people, I've been thinking about how to cleanse ancestral art that has been through the trauma of being in dungeons and museums in the US and Europe, but also with spaces. Ghana has the most slave forts and castles in the world. And they're sort of all over, just all over. So hidden in plain sight, you might not even know. And in some places, what has happened is they have been not officially, not through the government, but just, it's an empty building. So being turned into like a football court. For example, there's an old Dutch administration, which has sort of become broken down and now it's a football court. An old colonial bank that is now used as like, people have just sort of moved in. My only worry with that is these are also very heavy, like energetic spaces. So I'm not entirely sure about the processes that went through to also clear them of that before being repurposed. That's something that I have been thinking about. And then lastly, I wanted to talk a bit about funding. Hearing people talk about funding reminded me that like this year I've been really interested in the emergence, or maybe not the emergence, but like spotlight of itinerant and like moving galleries. And I've been really looking to that, especially I'm thinking of 3 galleries ran by Black women, Transplantation Gallery in Paris, Polactics Gallery that moves between Lagos and London, and Kendra Jane Patrick Gallery, which is mostly in New York. And just like, okay, well, yeah, there is no space, but how can I still continue to move around? And even galleries that are sharing space now, yeah, and moving into that model as well. And in Ghana in particular, you're seeing an increase in circular economy in that Ghanaian contemporary artists who are very much, what's the word, profited off of in the art market, and almost like African artists having a very extractive slash, it's almost like putting meat in a jungle, the way that the art market is dealing with particularly contemporary African artists and speculation and all of these things. But a number of, maybe like 5 contemporary Ghanaian artists have in the past 5 years started their own institutions in Accra. So have basically played the game of the art world, being, speculated about, fetishized, all of these things, and then built museums and studios and residency spaces for Ghanaian artists, and moving away from, having to be represented by colonial galleries and having that not have to be the option for artists who are to come. And that's really amazing. And I guess you can do that when your work is selling for like, thousands. I'm wondering, as a curator who doesn't have that kind of pull, how to do that. But just to say that I have noticed artists who are leading this institution building, and galleries who are also being very creative with lack of access to space.
That definitely brings me hope. And I love the idea of this Robin Hood model of stealing from the rich and starting your own space. I think that's great. But unless maybe someone else wants to extrapolate on what we do with these empty colonial buildings, I do have a few other questions. And maybe this one kind of for everyone, because we do have generally an arts background. And we're taught how to learn about art, how to look at art, but it all comes from a colonial European understanding of art. And for that matter, it's the class of the rich. We're not looking at the art of the working class. We're not looking at women art. We're not looking at non-binary people making art. So what are other ways that we can extrapolate the complexity of lived experience through art? How do we get away from static object labels? How do we get away from putting art in a vitrine? How do we get away from putting art on gallery walls and walking away? Oh, come on, guys. This is a juicy question. No one? Well, I think I'll pick on someone. Matt.
I think, something that is still creative beyond static objects in a vitrine. Um, you know, Going beyond different outlets of object making, we can, share stories and give space, making sure that folks are getting paid for their labor. Um, there's so many ways. Um, Even music, poetry, um, anything. Especially um, if the goal is to uplift the voices of BIPOC, particularly Black and Indigenous, um, and that will also change the narrative of what we've been fed for so many years and years, and that will definitely change what the system is. And I mean, since we're all artists here, it's just a matter of just being creative and seeing different ways of being able to express something.
Yeah, that is a good way of thinking a more multisensorial approach. But I saw Jordan's hand. Sorry. Yes.
I think in terms of really sharing those lived experiences, how do you experience an object? What is it used for? For me, my interest in anything that's object related or art related really stems from 10 generations of Kiowa artists that I descend from, and having objects used in ceremony and in community in their proper use. And it's actually upside down to go to these different institutions and to see somebody's like shoes vertically hung on a wall, or to see somebody's honor blanket laid flat out like a bear on a ground. Like, it's crazy. So I feel like, from my perspective, really being able to change those relationships means rechanging, radically shifting those access points. Where do we first encounter these objects? How do we encounter them? Who is giving us this sort of perspective? And I think a good example of that is to have things made in community and ceremony and used. And it's kind of, when I think about museums and the relationship to, at least to my community or even my family, I always think of it as like this big white glove that kind of comes down. And it's like, oh, I know my, great grandmother's cradle board, which is a baby carrier. I know it's in that museum, or I know that, my 2 times great grandpa's teepee, which he painted himself, is over there in that museum. And so to really shift that, I think, is to one, engage our own relationships more deeply, to engage them more authentically, which is it's already happening, but somehow intersect that with like public education or actually, that sounds really gross, not public education, but some sort of learning in a way that holds up those intrinsic values of the objects, um, and really take away the context of this kind of external force coming in and removing, looting, um, dislocating collections from communities and then sharing it to other communities. Yeah, is very problematic. But I think that future includes having first voice perspectives from those communities. So, as an Indigenous person, I wouldn't go up to Canada and tell them how they need to handle what that might look like, reimagining those relationships, because they have their own protocols and those protocols need to be honored. And that's part of sovereignty. That's part of recognizing that unless you're an Indigenous person, every person is a visitor here. And that sovereignty is connected to treaty relations, is connected to ancestral protocols, and within those protocols is embedded wellness, is embedded humanity and dignity. And so, even going back to the previous question around the architecture, um, to an extent, that land should be repatriated and everything on it to those communities. To everything is treaty territory, so that repatriation should happen not just with the objects but also with the land. And then to an extent, it's nobody's business what the nation decides to do, those small nations, what they decide to do with those things. It's like the conversation about the Black Hills, or even this, we had a program that went on at the museum that I work at around NAGPRA, Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. And it was like a live program. Somebody went in on the comments, mostly good comments, questions. Somebody went in on the comments and they were like, will the tribes be capable of properly preserving these objects, was the question. And even to think about that like level of narcissism and ownership of, well, maybe I know best, or maybe X institution knows best or better, it really goes into that colonial history of white supremacy and control and power and domination. So I feel like, it sort of ties in together that as we move into these futures that recognize histories, that recognize ancestral wisdom as a source of value, we can also move into those conversations around sovereignty and around how that will benefit not just Indigenous communities, but other communities, settler communities.
You've spoken such truths today that I'm going to take this entire day to process that. Thank you. And I think this also touches upon, and Lyra, I do see you, but there was other, yeah. The concept of ownership is something that casual museum visitors, white museum visitors, don't think about. They don't think about how the museum views their collection. It's capital. It's something that draws money in when they can boast that they have the largest collection of X artist or a largest collection of moche pots from Peru. The goal is to have as much stuff to draw as many people in to take money. So that is another aspect that needs to be separated from people's understandings of when they go to a museum. What you're looking at is the museum's bank account. You're looking at their assets. And so I wonder if that's something that maybe also Camille could speak about. But I did see Lyra, so Lyra's next.
I mean, I can always say something, but I wasn't actually raising a hand. That's just me doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt, Jordan, yeah, for those perspectives. I think just going back to the previous one of the previous questions, I just wanted to emphasize some of the things that were said about kind of multi-sensorial approaches to museum practice. You know, we're so immersed in the museum in this kind of just visual absorption of culture, of material culture, and just kind of echoing what Matt was saying about, like poems, music, these kinds of audio, tactile, other ways of interpreting. And I think it also really comes down to just from the beginning, making sure doors are open for Black and Indigenous museum professionals to work in these museums, and also even at the teaching level, who is teaching these practices in the universities, in the colleges. I did my master in museum studies, and it was primarily taught by white professors. And as a younger person that didn't have much experience, I started volunteering at a museum of Indigenous material culture in Toronto, and they had me, take these objects that were not mine, and circulate around the city and go to libraries and teach kids about these objects, and at the time you just think, this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is how I learned about collections care. And now just thinking back, I don't think those objects were mine to touch, to care for, to talk about, to educate folks about. So definitely, having first person care, first person interpretation in museums. And sorry, I just wanted to, you really inspired me when you were talking about those buildings that are converted to like a football field. It reminded me of one of my favorite artworks, which kind of goes back to that question of architecture and monuments, of what to do with those buildings once they're empty, if they're ever empty. And I don't know if anybody knows the Palestinian artist Khaled Jarrar, but he has this practice where he would actually go and collect cement from the separation wall in the West Bank, and then create sculpture. And he created a lot of sports related sculpture like volleyball, basketball, footballs, and things like that, to kind of to try to get people to think about what the separation wall is preventing Indigenous folks there from engaging in leisure and just happiness and things like that. So I just wanted to bring that up because you really reminded me of that. And yeah, just that paternalism, I've conducted interviews with museum professionals even just 2 years ago who are settlers, and who are in charge of collections. And I've been told that they only recently started to agree that we should be repatriating objects. It's again that sort of paternalistic viewpoint that, oh, do source communities have the resources? It's always that resource talk. Do they have the resources to care for these collections? So yeah, I definitely think a rotation or a switch needs to happen in there. But sorry, Felicia, I think you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, but Camille, thank you. And it also touches upon something we could maybe talk about in another iteration, but the politics and colonialism of conservation and this obsession with conserving looted tomb objects that were never meant to be existing this long. But that's a whole nother month. And Felicia, take it away.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about, Jordan made me really think about systems of value, which is something that I am constantly is constantly on my mind at work. Like museums are, again, obsessed with capitalism, and they see their collections as dollar signs, and it's with Indigenous objects, the monetary value comes from the rareness or the exoticism, and it's like, who is it more valuable to, the museum who has the only example of a certain object, or to the community who can use that to start creating whatever that thing is again? We have a large collection of Dene textiles, and they are rolled up for storage purposes, and I have never seen most of them. And we had an artist come in who is studying rare textile techniques, and he is reverse engineering what he sees to learn how to use these techniques again. And I just, it makes me so upset to think about all of these textiles that I've never seen before, but our institution really values them because they're the only example of X thing. But it's this artist can come in, and having access to them can, reintroduce whatever that practice is to the community. And museums are preventing that. They are, I feel like preserving the value of those objects by preventing access by people who could use them to, you know, make them less rare. And so, I mean, obviously, as I said, I'm like invested in these institutions, but these are the kinds of, I don't like situations that I'm constantly thinking about and conflicted about. And yeah.
I think you really touched upon something in terms of scarcity and rarity. And again, everything, all roads lead to capitalism, but I think we've all touched on it in some way, because the more you keep something away, the higher value it becomes, the higher rarity it becomes, and the more museums can use it to sell. The more museums could also use it to bargain for big exhibitions. If they have X painting or X object, they can use that to negotiate. So really, yeah, they're being used as tools. They're being used as capital, which is also extremely depressing, and something someone else touched on, the ways that these objects and pieces have been traumatized, being used in such a way that perverts it. So that is something, again, we can talk about for 100 years, and we should. But for now, we've reached the 1:30 mark in our panel, so it's time to turn it over to our great questions that we've been collecting from the audience. We've already got a couple of great questions on deck, but please continue to put in questions in the chat, and we'll get through as many of them as possible. But starting out, this is a great question, I suspect, from one of our fantastic colleagues. As much as we need to restructure these museums, ancestral cultural items housed in these spaces may not be able to go home. So how do we structure them for better stewardship? Oh, and feel free to jump in and unmute yourselves if you want to jump in on this question.
Could you? I was going to say, could you read the question again?
I could read it again. As much as we need to restructure these museums, ancestral cultural items housed in these spaces may not be able to go home. How do we structure them for better stewardship?
Who has decided that they're not able to go home is my question.
Yeah,
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Yes, that was sort of my first thought, especially touching on what Jordan and Camille Marie talked about, the paternalism of museums, and just thinking, oh well, you know, so and so community will not be able to care for it. The British Museum says that a lot. But my thing with that is, okay, if you're saying that XYZ country does not have an institution that could house it, why is that? It's because of British colonialism. That is why there are not resources to be put into a cultural industry. So it feels, I would even go as far as say like very a pathetic excuse to say that, when it's like you are not only sitting on the cultural capital, but you're sitting on the financial capital that could be invested into stewardship and institutions that do that work here. And the British Museum and other European museums in particular have so many like repatriation panel. I've even been on one of their like workshops. You know, you've used this money to fly out people and rent hotels and have like a conference on repatriation, which which I feel like is a way to palliate people. That's not a word, I think, but to calm people's energy and to continue to dominate this conversation and give false hope, knowing that it's really a lot simpler than it actually is, instead of having these conversations and continuing to dominate and say that, you know, there isn't a way to return. And return is always possible. And if anything, Jordan also talked about how ridiculous it is walking into a museum and seeing an object or art that is used in practice on display. So even when I hear that thing of, oh, well, so and so community can't care for them, I'm like, well, you can't either. And you look very silly when I walk in and see like something that is clearly like an object that's meant to be used on display. So really, who is deciding who is worthy of care? And how can you say that something that you did not even make and store and clearly have shown no care whatsoever, if this was like a child care, like court, you know, custody would definitely be taken away when you look at who has treated what. But
oh, that is going to be your magnum opus. You need to turn that into a book immediately. And I think I saw Jordan. Raise your hand.
I just wanted to add to this question. I feel like I totally agree with what's been said. Who do we ask, and who is being asked to ask others? I feel like that question really butts into institutional relationships with source communities, and lack of trust. You know, centuries after something was taken, it's hard to have those conversations. And a lot of the times, the best person to lead those conversations are not settler scholars or settler practitioners. The best person to lead those conversations are people from those communities. And that is why it's so important to recognize treaty territories and recognize the history of not only just that timestamp of a treaty territory, which, you know, these relationships between nations began with the US, but even before that, there's nations here in Oklahoma that had treaties with the French. There's nations that had interactions with Spaniards long before Americans even got to this part of the country. And so when we're thinking about territories and we're thinking about repatriation, that conversation across time and space, across a land, really is intersectional and really depends on the object. But I feel like it's so important to say that those conversations need to be led by community members. And, you know, the idea that, oh, we can't find anybody to accept this object back is not, that's not a real thing. That's a colonial myth, created by limitations that the institution likely doesn't even fully understand. So I just wanted to say that.
And thank you for saying it. That was fantastic. Matt, go for it.
Well, just to add on to what Jordan was saying, you know, if they can't even figure out like where it's supposed to go to, then clearly your system isn't working.
I really love this idea of taking museums to court and judging their paternity, because that really delicious. We could probably spend a bunch more time on this question because it is really interesting, but there's a couple others. So one of the other one is, can anyone speak to experiences creating organizations within alternative management structures like cooperatives or flat structures? I feel like this one is Matt, Yaa, and maybe Lyra specific.
Yeah, I can talk about a little bit about the community that I founded, Philippine Ex-Artists of Houston. It all started with a conversation, actually, with an institution. It is with Asia Society of Texas, because I felt like we weren't being represented well enough, and the way our organization works is that we're not a nonprofit, where we don't have any kind of position, you know, like a president, vice president, or whatever. We just work on our own, kind of like trusting that every member takes leadership on whatever project that they want to propose, and just having the community support that, you know, in any way we can, in the best ways that we're, you know, more talented, you know, in doing. But yeah, and it's worked. Actually, it has worked, you know, as good as I ever imagined. You know, because I didn't really want to impose any kind of power structures or levels in the whole community. You know, especially that I'm a straight man, you know, like trying to govern, you know, a community of uh, of people who identify, you know, with different genders. I didn't want to, you know, I kind of like sit back and listen. Um, so And it's the same way with the A-Leaf Art House. I have a group of friends who help contribute, but we're not really structured in a way where that someone is like having like the end say to everything. Everything is always um, within the um, advice of the community and how that will benefit the community. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that is a really interesting way of thinking about it too. Of once you've created this flat structure, nobody's ego is really getting in the way anymore. Nobody's vested capital interests are really getting in the way anymore because these spaces are not founded with that intention. So already it's such a huge departure. And so for that reform structure to be imposed on these big museums, I should say, big, well-funded museums, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a corpse. It's a little, so thinking about how, rather than using these flat structures to fix museums, going out of the museum structure and starting your own flat organization seems to be the way to go. Unless Lyra or Yaa would like to talk about their organizations. Okay, then we will move right along. Can anyone imagine folding the concept of museums into mutual aid organizations so that the collection, exhibition, and funding of art remain as fundamental to our lives as food and shelter? That's a good one. Nobody talks. I'm going to pick on one of you. Jordan.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
I could repeat the question. Imagine folding the concept of museums into mutual aid organizations so that the collection, exhibition, and funding of art remains as fundamental to our lives as food and shelter.
I think I think I've seen this done in Indigenous communities where the reproduction of our ancestral objects is so important that it actually impacts collective health mentally, spiritually so much. So when I hear that question, I think of I was at a kuich once, which is a potlatch in Sitka as a guest with friends, and the potlatch was centered around accessing herring eggs, fish eggs, and Alaska representatives from the city and I think the state were there, and there was oral history that was shared, and just from memory, I don't recall exactly which clan leader said it, but it was said that if our community doesn't have access to herring eggs because of overfishing in the area, that we will cease to exist. And stories were shared of the abundance that people grew up on of this ancestral food, which is being used as a resource by fishing industry and different companies in the area. For me, I feel like having that relationship to object is inherent and in many ways has been interrupted or disrupted through museum practices. And this is many Indigenous communities have these stories of our beautiful objects, ancestral objects being taken away. And then of course, not just that collecting practice, but also, what happened to communities legislatively, these acts of genocide, going to boarding school and having language banned, hair cut, and really just these forced assimilation tactics by governments. These were all simultaneous sort of histories, and they continue to impact people in the most devastating ways, which isn't to say, that trauma is our only legacy as Indigenous people. That's certainly not true, but it is a really significant part of the relationship that we have, my nation has, specifically speaking, to state and national government. So when we think about objects, object-centered community practices, I feel like I know what that looks like. I feel like I've seen that. And having those dialogues in your excuse me, in your state or in your region or your area, again, I feel like if you would like to know what that looks like, definitely create space, create funding, create time and availability to be able to consult with scholars who have been doing this work, and not just scholars because they're these entry points, but the communities and the grandmothers and the grandfathers who have been living these stories through time.
Yeah, I think that hits on a lot of even more evidence as to why art history needs to be abolished, because the way that we're taught to look at objects in museums is not what these memories and lived histories and shared histories that imbue these very alive pieces were meant to be viewed as. So you're, contributing to fetishization of these objects. You're trying to understand an entire history's culture and ongoing history through one looted object in a museum, and already that is incorrect. So all of art history needs to be retooled and dismantled before we can even get to the idea of, well, how do we turn museums into community centers? Because like Jordan was saying, these communities already are existing and using art to connect one another through oral history, through culture, through practice. And that's not what museums are about. They're about money. So already it's wrong to think of big museums. And I think that's something maybe we should clarify when we say death to museums. We're talking about the Met, we're talking about the Guggenheim, we're talking about oil-funded institutions. We're not necessarily talking about culturally specific institutions or spaces like Matt's or Yaa's or Lyra's initiatives that were made with such different intention that I even hesitate to call them as part of the big art world, because they already are so different in the practices that they're using. They actually care about humans, which already is a huge departure from big museums. But that's aside from what this question was talking about. And I think maybe the answer that we've reached is art is already folded into so many people's communities, and it's already folded into so many people's lives. We don't really need a museum to do that. We have it. And Lyra, go for it.
Yeah. So this is hard when I've never done a panel where I don't know who's asking the questions, and I hope this doesn't come across super harshly. I don't know where you're coming from, person who asked the question, but that sounds like a question that can't imagine from a lack of imagination of any other way to interact with art, to interact with material objects. Um, this paradigm of collection, of exhibition, right? Like these are fundamentally part of the museum structures, the Western colonialist museum structures that are the problem, right? I haven't heard anybody really talking about collecting as an active process that we want to be encouraging, even the museums that we think are pretty good, right? Or the ones that some of the folks on this panel are working for, right? The conversation isn't, oh yeah, I'm working on like acquiring this great blah, 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 right? Which is what most of museum stuff is, right? Museums are based on this idea that like collecting is better, right? And exhibiting things is good. And that's not actually how material culture works for most people in most periods of history. And I think this is actually maybe where I also want to just kind of like throw in that where I'm coming from in this conversation is I approach all of this, and I view all of this from the perspective of my training as an anthropological archaeologist, which is my like which is what underneath is underneath everything else that I have done, right, and that I've picked up along the ways. And so yeah, and so for me, like these fundamental questions of art is not art. It's or rather, art objects are not art. they're not fundamentally art necessarily, right? There is no such thing as a fundamentally art object. These things are all hugely culturally specific, and the mind game that that Western colonialism like played on everybody was to suggest that everybody needs to have their own museum on the mall, right? Everybody needs to have all of their valuable things collected in a museum because that's what makes them real, right? Every artist has to have a piece in XYZ collection because that's what makes them a real artist. Otherwise, they're not a real artist, right? Like this is this is nonsense. The end.
Thank you for that mic drop moment. And I did see Yaa go for it.
Yes. On that note, I was going to say, like, just very recently, as of last week, the Royal Academy of Arts in London is currently having a debate as to whether, say, I've forgotten, but it's quite hefty, maybe between 50 to 100 jobs, or sell their Michelangelo. And it's so bizarre. Like, this is a real sort of conversation that's happening. And I'm like, wow, not to be rude, but this man is dead. And these people are alive and need jobs. And it's a pandemic. And this is a real conversation that is being had. Like, what is to gain here, actually? Like, what are you actually saying about your values? And what are you actually saying? Because culture is also produced by people. But you clearly don't care about culture, even though you are a culture institution. It's actually from a completely different place. And with that, and thinking about collection practices as well, and the need to physically mark land and places and ownership, I think it also, that there's also a different relationship to memory. I feel like a false relationship to memory, because particularly why at the beginning I talked about how there seems to be more conversation around ephemera and embodiment, and even with these, like, the moving galleries, I think that it also is the kind of changing our relationship to material culture and memory, or maybe not even changing, just like returning, because particularly when I think of like African cultural and thought and cosmology, there is that idea of, I may not know my ancestors' names because the documents have been destroyed by various colonial administration, but they very much live with me. And they didn't need to put their name on a building, or invade another country and steal everybody's art to be remembered. That to me seems like it comes from insecurity, and just really not an understanding of life and death, and memory. And like, I will be remembered, like, regardless, through when you plant a tree, or through the people that you interact with. And so when the Royal Academy of Arts asked, should we sell Michelangelo or save people's jobs, to me, I'm like, that's when you see a fundamental disconnect between what culture institutions say that they do and what they actually do.
I spiritually just awoke. Thank you. Yeah. Oh my God. But Lyra, I saw your name again, your hand again.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I did not know that they were doing that. It's perfect. I mean, like, when I say thank you, I also mean, like, I needed that. I needed to know that they were doing that because it's exactly an illustration of all of it, all the things that are wrong, right? And it also reminded me of how in New York, the timing of, I wish I could remember the exact dates, but I remember it felt like literally that the day that we started the quarantine here, pretty much, because, it was like the epicenter. A lot of people were dying, like people couldn't even get to the hospital in time. And to move away from museums that are more collections focused and more like art world focused, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum sent out an appeal asking for our money to help keep them alive. Like literally like the day after. And it was just like, where are you? Like, who would ever, I mean, mind you, that museum has a lot of issues, like a lot of issues. I just saw they released their racial anti-racism report today, this morning, which if I had read that, I'm sure that's all I would be talking about today. You know, um, but yeah, just think that like, oh my God, people are literally dying. People are literally losing their jobs and their houses. And you want us to give you money to keep your museum alive? And what, your rich donors can't do that? I mean, come on.
even more when you read that the loans that were given to these gigantic museums that already had gigantic endowments, where'd that money go? It's something we should be asking the court, although the court won't help us. We have time for a couple more questions, even though we're running a bit short. So to the audience, unfortunately, we won't get to all of the questions, but you can always email us at debttomuseums@gmail.com and maybe ask a question specifically to one of the panelists, and we can be sure to hook you up. But here's a really good one. For the panelists, who or what do you look for inspiration in the work that you do, either operating within or outside museums? And I actually want to talk to Camille Mary because she's been very quiet.
Oh God, that's a really great question. I don't know if I'm the best person to speak to this question because I'm nearing the end of my degree and I'm just super over it and disenchanted and a bit depressed actually. But actually, discussions like these, meeting and talking to folks who are doing amazing work on the ground is what keeps me motivated. Interviewing museum professionals, even for my research, that have been doing really great work. And like I mentioned, I think at the beginning is I'm really into looking at the history of protests in museums, especially in Canada, and just kind of reviewing these histories, highlighting these histories. There is a Canadian professor at Western University, Christy Robertson, who just recently published a book on museums and activism, and she kind of highlights Canadian histories of activism in museums. A lot of stories that have, kind of been muted, at least in the museum studies discipline, and reviewing these stories, kind of reviewing the important work that our elders have done, I think is really important and motivating to me, even if we acknowledge that it hasn't been enough and that we need to do way more. But yeah, those would be kind of my couple of suggestions for staying positive.
I think you were the right person to ask that question because I'm feeling similarly rejuvenated. Would anyone else like to talk about who or what is inspiring them to keep going? Yeah, Nat.
For me, really, it's the people, especially the community that I serve with my space. Alief is already known as like the most diverse neighborhood in Houston, but also we don't have like an art movement. So knowing and meeting everyone who are artists who do something creative or who has just this passion of like uplifting the neighborhood, they're the ones who's really, making me keep on going. And even just like the neighbors who just stop by the space whenever I'm there and just say hi, and they're always like, so excited to learn something about it, or just ask what it is. I mean, that's the whole idea of the space existing there. And Yeah, I mean, they're like the biggest inspiration, really.
I love that the common thread between all of these answers is that it's the people, not the institutions, which I think can be easily confused when you think about hearing from a lot of older folk who work in museums, where they have this idea that the museum is this innocent child that needs to be rescued and saved. And to Yaa and Lyra's points, it's the people who make these institutions what they are, specifically the BIPOC workers who are doing the hardest work, working in the most unforgiving institutions that hurt them, that are doing incredible work. And that is what should be celebrated, not the donors, not big oil, not Bank of America for sponsoring exhibitions. So it's all of us that we should continue to be inspired by. And on that note, it is 1:58. We have been talking for 2 hours, you guys. You are incredible. If you have any final thoughts, of course, be sure to say them. But all of your Instagram and information where you can be contacted is in our YouTube chat. You can also find it on our social media platforms if you want to reach out to any of the panelists. So any concluding thoughts from anyone?
Well, so my thought is also kind of goes to this question of what inspires me as well, which is you know, all of the movement work that's happening right now, right?
Yeah.
And how much of it is in the streets. And
Yeah.
those are the streets that I'm studying. Those are the streets that I am figuring out how to like reveal elements of. You know, one of the main places that people gather for protests in New York is Union Square, directly underneath a statue of George Washington on a horse in like, you know, typical overseer, you know, pose with his arm literally outstretched over all of these people who are gathering to, you know, protest police brutality. It's like, wow, you know, and yet it's yeah. And so one of my, you know, I started a major project there a couple years ago called Washington's Next, and it still isn't a thing, right? People are still not seeing that statue and are still not seeing how that statue and so many statues around the city do the work. Also do the work of maintaining the structures that everyone is
Yeah.
protesting against. And so that, you know, I haven't, that's my fault. I haven't figured that out yet. So that inspires me to keep going.
Yeah, the work is continuing. That's also something we should acknowledge. This isn't going to happen overnight. We got to keep going in the streets and, of course, wear a mask. But also, social media has been instrumental. It's led us to meet all of you and our audience. It's brought us all together. So I hate to look for upsides in a pandemic, but what Matt was saying, now is truly the time. This is the time for action and the time for change. And we're not going back to normal. We refuse. So on that note, thank you all so much for joining us on this panel. I'm really inspired, and I hope everyone watching either live or in the recording can take all of these knowledgeable folks with them, because we are the future of museums and we refuse to let it continue as it is. So we're going to say goodbye. Have a fantastic rest of your Saturday, and thank you all so much. Thanks. See you next year, because we will actually be taking a 2-month break. But after that, we'll be a little more active on social media. So keep your eyes peeled for more information. Bye, everybody.